There are moments in history when the world seems to slide toward its lowest point, when the machinery of power presses down on the weak with all its weight, when hunger becomes a weapon and cities become bargaining chips. There are moments when ordinary people stand at the edge of collapse, waiting for the final blow, and no one expects salvation. And then, against the predictions of experts, against the arithmetic of geopolitics, against the logic of war itself, a miracle happens. Not a miracle of saints or angels, a miracle of engines, of wings, of men determined to defy impossible odds. This is the story of the Berlin Airlift. But to understand why it mattered, why it remains one of the most astonishing operations in human history, you must return to a single night in June 1948, a night when the last trains stopped, the last trucks halted, the last barges moored, and a city of 2 million people suddenly found itself held hostage. Berlin lay like a great island of ruins in the heart of a devastated Germany, a divided country inside a divided world. The war had ended only 3 years earlier, but the ashes had not cooled, and in that darkness rose the first true confrontation of the Cold War, the moment when Joseph Stalin decided to test whether the Western Allies possessed the resolve to stand their ground, or whether they would abandon Berlin to starvation, pressure, and political collapse. What came next would defy every calculation, every expectation, every assumption about logistics, politics, and human endurance. This is the day the sky became a lifeline. The day pilots became heroes without firing a single shot. The day the Soviet blockade met its enemy, not in tanks or artillery, but in the roar of aircraft engines that never stopped. This is the story of how the heavens saved a city. Berlin in 1945 looked less like a metropolis and more like the skeleton of a civilization. The Allied bombing campaign had left entire districts flattened, as if a giant hand had swept across the map with deliberate cruelty. Families lived in basements beneath the rubble of what once were homes. Water dripped down walls charred by firestorms. Children scavenged for coal among ruins, filling sacks with handfuls of black dust that could be traded for bread. Women cleared the streets with bare hands, forming long human chains that passed bricks from one to the next. Every breath tasted of dust. Every dawn carried the memory of sirens. Every night, the ghosts of the Reich that had burned itself to ashes. And yet, out of this ruin emerged a fragile, trembling hope. The Allies, the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets administered Berlin together, dividing it into 4 sectors. In theory, it was a temporary arrangement. In reality, it was a time bomb hidden beneath the rubble. Because the alliance that had defeated Hitler was already cracking. The Soviet Union, having lost 27 million people, saw Germany not as a defeated nation to rebuild, but as a buffer to dominate. Stalin wanted security, total, unbreakable security. In his mind, any strength Germany regained was a threat, and any influence the West tried to assert inside Berlin, deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, was a challenge to Soviet authority. It was only a matter of time before the fault lines erupted. By 1947, the tensions had sharpened into something cold, metallic, and dangerous. The Western Allies introduced reforms to rebuild German industry. Stalin responded with sabotage and intimidation. American officers reported Soviet patrols stopping their trains, searching their personnel, asserting control over checkpoints. British convoys were halted for technical violations. French shipments were delayed or seized. It was not yet war, but it was no longer peace. Berlin became the symbolic heart of this confrontation, a city carved into sectors, isolated in the middle of Soviet-controlled territory, dependent on the goodwill of an increasingly hostile regime. Roads, railways, canals, all threads connecting West Berlin to the world passed through Soviet checkpoints. The Soviets held the valves of the city's lifelines, and Stalin was about to close them. At 1 a.m. on June 24, 1948, the lights flickered across West Berlin. Power surged, dimmed, then died entirely. Refrigerators clicked off. Street lamps went dark. Radios fell silent mid-broadcast. And in the command centers of the Allied sectors, telephones began to ring with a chilling message. The Soviets have cut off all electricity. Then came the second blow. Trains approaching Berlin were halted and rerouted back toward West Germany. The Soviets claimed technical difficulties, but when Allied officials inspected the track, they found barricades hastily erected during the night, logs, steel plates, planted mines. Hours later, Soviet guards shut down highways entering Berlin. Trucks were turned away. Barges carrying food and fuel were blocked at canal locks. All ground routes were severed. Berlin, a city of 2 million people, was now isolated behind an iron cordon. General Clay, the American military governor, understood immediately what the blockade meant. If Berlin falls, he told his staff, Germany falls. If Germany falls, Europe falls. And Stalin knew it too. He believed the West would not risk war to save Berlin. He believed they would evacuate the city and leave it to Soviet control. The blockade, in his eyes, was a bloodless victory waiting to be claimed. A masterstroke that required no tanks, no aircraft, no combat, only silence. The silence of empty roads, the silence of darkened homes, the silence of a city slowly starving. It was not just a political confrontation, it was a calculation of physics, calories, and fear. Daily consumption needed for survival. Coal, 3,500 tons. Food, 1,500 tons. Medicine, 150 tons. Miscellaneous supplies, 550 tons. Total, 6,000 tons per day. West Berlin had reserves for just 36 days of food. For coal, essential for heating, cooking, and power generation, only 18 days. In less than 3 weeks, hospitals would begin to fail. In a month, factories would shut down. In a winter, thousands would freeze to death. Stalin had turned hunger into a weapon. The question now was whether the West would choose surrender or defiance. When American generals gathered in emergency conference on June 25th, most saw only 2 options, both catastrophic. Option 1, force a ground convoy through Soviet checkpoints, but that meant war, a war the world was not prepared to fight. Option 2, evacuate the city and concede Berlin to the Soviets, but that meant abandoning 2 million civilians and abandoning moral authority in the early Cold War. Then, as officers debated, someone mentioned a technical fact buried in an old agreement. The Soviets had never restricted air corridors. The skies over Berlin were still open. General Clay turned slowly. "Could we fly supplies into Berlin?" he asked. Most laughed, some scoffed, others shook their heads. One officer replied bluntly, "Sir, to sustain 2 million people by air is physically impossible." But Clay did not ask whether it was possible. He asked whether it was necessary. The math was brutal. Even if the Americans used every C-47 they had in Europe, the old Goonie Bird transport, they could deliver maybe 700 tons per day, far below the 6,000 needed. To reach that number, they would need more aircraft than had ever been assembled for humanitarian logistics. They would need operations 24 hours a day for months without pause.
They would need perfect coordination, perfect maintenance, perfect courage, and even then, luck would have to stand with them. But Clay sensed something the numbers could not capture. The blockade was not just about Berlin, it was about the soul of the Western Alliance. If they abandoned Berlin now, how could they defend Vienna or Greece or Turkey or any corner of Europe threatened by Soviet expansion? No, they had to stand their ground, even if the sky was the only battlefield left to them. Clay stood from his chair. He said, "We stay in Berlin, we supply Berlin, and we do it by air." History turned on that sentence.
The first aircraft lifted off on June 26th from Wiesbaden Air Base. A C-47, engines sputtering in the summer heat, carrying just 8,000 pounds of cargo, flour and dried milk. It looked insignificant, almost pathetic compared to the scale of the crisis. But when it descended through low clouds and touched down at Tempelhof Airport, Berliners gathered at the fence and erupted into cheers. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders. Old women waved handkerchiefs. Men wept openly. One Berlin woman later wrote in her diary, "The sound of those engines was the sound of freedom itself." What began as a trickle became a stream. What became a stream became a river of wings. Within 3 days, US and British pilots were flying every 3 minutes. Old aircraft were pulled from scrapyards, repaired with parts cannibalized from wrecks, and put back into service. Factories in Britain reopened production lines to build spare engines. Maintenance crews worked until their knuckles bled, sleep-deprived but relentless. But the challenge was enormous. Early airlift numbers. Daily need, 6,000 tons. Actual deliveries, 1,000 tons. The city was still starving faster than the sky could feed it. Something dramatic had to change. On July 28th, General William H. Tunner arrived in Berlin. Tunner was no ordinary commander. He was the man who had orchestrated the legendary Hump Airlift over the Himalayas during World War II, one of the deadliest flight routes on Earth. If anyone could defy the impossible, it was him. He surveyed the situation with the cold efficiency of a surgeon preparing for triage. Aircraft were stacking up in holding patterns. Crews were landing manually in bad weather. Berlin's airports were chaotic, crowded, and under-equipped. Tunner delivered a simple decree. No aircraft will circle Berlin. No aircraft will wait. You land on schedule or you return to base. He created an airborne assembly line, a conveyor belt made of aluminum and courage. Rules were rewritten. Pilots were forbidden from talking on the radio except in emergencies. Flight corridors were fixed to prevent collisions. Precision timing was enforced to the second. Ground crews had exactly 30 minutes to unload each aircraft. If unloading took 31 minutes, the next aircraft would be forced to divert. Then Tunner introduced the aircraft that would change everything, the C-54 Skymaster. Larger, stronger, more reliable, capable of carrying 10 tons per flight. Within a single week, delivery capacity jumped from 1,000 tons per day to 3,000 tons per day. But the city needed more. Winter was coming, and winter in Berlin was a sentence of death. When snow began to fall in November 1948, pilots felt a chill not just on their skin, but in their hearts. Winter in Berlin was unforgiving. Ice storms, freezing fog, crosswinds strong enough to tilt aircraft sideways on approach. During the worst fog of the season, visibility dropped to less than 100 meters. Aircraft descended blindly toward runways they could not see. Some clipped trees, some skidded into snowbanks, others crashed on approach, metal twisting like paper. On November 29th,
A C-54 went down short of the runway at Tempelhof, killing all aboard. Hours later, another crashed attempting takeoff from Wiesbaden. Tunner feared morale would collapse, but the next morning, every pilot reported for duty. One British crew member wrote in his logbook, "If Berlin can endure winter without heat, we can endure winter without fear." It became a season of unyielding discipline. Aircraft were de-iced with boiling water poured from tankers. Pilots flew with frost forming on their eyebrows. Ground crews worked with fingers numb to the bone. The Soviets expected the airlift to fail under the pressure. Instead, it hardened into something indestructible. By December, the airlift was delivering 5,000 tons per day. Not enough for comfort, but enough for survival. And then came the turning point.
Food kept people alive, but coal kept the city standing. Without coal, power plants could not generate electricity. Without electricity, water pumps would fail. Without water, Berlin would collapse overnight. But coal is heavy, dense, dirty. To deliver thousands of tons per day required a miracle bordering on madness. Tunner reorganized the airlift once again. Aircraft were assigned exclusively to coal, their interiors coated in tar to prevent abrasion. Workers in Berlin unloaded coal with shovels, faces blackened, clothes soaked in sweat even in winter. Runways became dusted with coal powder, turning shoes and tools pitch black. And yet, Berliners cheered every coal plane as if it carried gold, because in truth, it did. Coal meant heat. Heat meant survival. The airlift was now delivering 6,000 tons per day, the threshold required for the city to live. The blockade had failed. Stalin simply refused to admit it. Berliners were not passive recipients of aid. They became partners in their own survival. Doctors rationed medicine with mathematical precision. Bakers stretched flour to the gram. Engineers repaired generators with scrap metal. Teachers conducted classes in bombed-out buildings, children wearing gloves indoors to keep warm. And in Tempelhof Airport, Berliners formed human chains miles long to unload aircraft. Grandmothers in wool coats, teenagers with soot on their cheeks, men who had survived the war now standing in freezing weather, handing sacks from one to another, determined not to let their city die. A pilot named Halverson began dropping candy attached to handkerchief parachutes for children waiting near the fence. Berliners named him Uncle Wiggly Wings. Soon, American children began donating sweets to support the cause. Pilots filled bags with chocolate, gum, and raisins. Thousands of tiny parachutes drifted into the hands of children who had once known only hunger. The blockade meant to break Berlin's spirit, instead united it into something indomitable. By spring 1949, the truth was undeniable. The Soviet blockade had failed. The city was alive. The airlift was stronger than ever. Daily deliveries were now 8,000 tons, then 9,000, then a record-shattering 12,940 tons in a single day. Stalin realized that the blockade was not weakening the West, it was strengthening their alliance, hardening their resolve, forging Germany's loyalty to democratic reconstruction. In the Kremlin, silence replaced bravado. Reports flowed in showing Berliners refusing Soviet rations, refusing Soviet bribes, refusing Soviet propaganda. In April, Soviet negotiators quietly approached the West. On May 12, 1949, at 12:01 a.m., the roads reopened. Lights flickered on. Trains rolled. The blockade was over. But the airlift continued for 4 more months to show that Berlin would never again be held hostage. By the time the operation ended, it had delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies, 277,000 flights, 92 million miles flown,
21 pilots had died, but a city had lived. The Berlin Airlift was not a battle of armies. It was a battle of endurance, of mathematics, of steel, of faith. It proved that freedom can be supplied by the ton, that courage can be measured in engines per minute, that the sky can be a shield as real as any fortress. And it proved that the Cold War, for all its threats and fears, would be shaped not only by bombs and armies, but by the quiet, relentless determination of men and women who refused to bow to tyranny. The Soviets had closed the roads. The West opened the heavens. In the end, Stalin learned a truth he never forgot. You can blockade a city, but you cannot blockade the sky.
There are winters that simply freeze the land, and there are winters that attempt to erase a people. The winter of 1948-1949 descended on Berlin with a cruelty that felt personal, as if the very wind carried Stalin's command to finish what the blockade had begun. Temperatures plunged below freezing for weeks at a time, water pipes burst, coal ovens went cold, breath crystallized into white plumes that floated through ruined buildings like wandering spirits. In the brittle silence of dawn, the city creaked like an old ship locked in ice, its timbers strained to breaking. Inside thousands of apartments, Berliners woke each morning not sure whether their neighbors had survived the night. Children slept in their coats. Parents rationed heat by burning books and furniture, sacrificing memories to keep hearts beating a little longer. Doctors wrote prescriptions that could not be filled. Teachers held classes where the only warmth came from the bodies huddled together. Each evening, as lights flickered and died, the city braced for the worst. And through that frozen darkness came the sound that saved them. Not hymns, not prayers, but engines. Engines that thundered through winter storms, engines that carved corridors through fog thick as concrete, engines that refused to yield to a blockade that was supposed to crush a people into submission. The Soviets thought winter would be the West's undoing. Instead, winter became the forge that tempered the airlift into something unstoppable. What follows is the other half of the miracle: the struggle, the sacrifice, the triumph that transformed an improvised rescue mission into the first decisive victory of the Cold War. By January 1949, Berlin existed in a state of suspended animation. Factories worked at half capacity. Hospitals ran on emergency generators. The water supply was rationed by district. Children collected splinters of coal dropped from trucks like precious jewels. Men lined up in makeshift kitchens, bowls in hand, waiting for meals that seemed smaller each day. Women mended their clothing with threads pulled from curtains and old rags. Berlin had not suffered this kind of hardship even during the war. But the psychological war was the real weapon. Soviet patrols stood at the borders, silent and immovable, watching trains sit dead on tracks that once carried blood life into the western sectors. Propaganda blasted through loudspeakers in the Soviet zone, announcing that the airlift was a failure, that the West would abandon the city, that starvation was inevitable. Yet the Berliners had learned to listen for something else: the low, distant rumble of aircraft engines. It became the pulse of the city, regular, stubborn, defiant. Every time an aircraft passed overhead, the message was clear: you have not been forgotten. February arrived with a punishment no commander could prepare for: fog thick enough to blind pilots at arm's reach. A gray wall settled along all three air corridors, swallowing the horizon and smothering the city in a colorless haze. Aircraft plunged into it like stones tossed into water, vanishing instantly. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters, then 30, then 10. Runway lights became meaningless, instruments iced over, cockpits filled with condensation that dripped like rain. Engines roared and sputtered, their sound oddly muted by the fog, as if the blockade had found a way to silence even the sky.
General Tunner faced the test of his career. Ground radar operators were pushed to their limits, guiding aircraft they could not see. Some landed by dead reckoning, feeling their wheels hit the runway by instinct alone. Others slid sideways on the frozen pavement and were caught by snowbanks that tore metal like paper. One British pilot radioed in a calm voice, "I am flying blind into the arms of God." Moments later, his plane touched down perfectly, guided entirely by radar. But not all were so fortunate. A C-54 crashed short of the runway, the fuselage plowing through fog and snow before erupting in flame. Crews sprinted out with extinguishers, slipping on ice, dragging survivors through the smoke. Hours later, another aircraft overshot the runway, its tires skidding across glassy ice until it smashed through barricades. Tunner stood in the operations tower, jaw locked, eyes burning with exhaustion. He refused to shut the airlift down. He refused to blink. And Berliners, hearing crashes in the night, lit candles in their windows as a silent promise. Keep coming. We are still here.
To deliver thousands of tons per day through winter storms required something beyond courage. It required reinvention. Engineers overhauled engines in record time. Mechanics worked in temperatures so low that tools froze to their gloves. They built makeshift shelters from tarps and scrap wood to protect aircraft from ice storms that could snap propellers clean off. And then came the greatest innovation of the airlift, the Radar Precision Approach System. It allowed pilots to land solely by instruments, descending through fog so thick they could not see their own wings. American crews called it the talk down because operators literally guided pilots word by word. Left, steady, bring it down, hold, touchdown. This system turned the airlift from a desperate improvisation into a scientific marvel. Pilots trusted voices in their headsets as if they were lifelines. At Tempelhof, the talk-down operators became as revered as the pilots themselves. In one 24-hour period, not a single aircraft collided or was diverted, despite visibility barely better than blindness. The Soviets had hoped the weather would kill the airlift. Instead, it forged a new era of aviation. Frustrated by the airlift's resilience, the Soviets increased pressure in ways that skirted the edge of open warfare. Fighter jets buzzed dangerously close to transport planes. Floodlights blinded crews on final approach. Radio frequencies were saturated with interference. Air balloons were drifted into air corridors as airborne mines. Anti-aircraft guns performed training exercises alarmingly close to the flight routes. Every pilot knew that a single miscalculation could become an international incident. But Tunner issued a directive with the force of an oath. There will be no retaliation. Our weapon is discipline. Berliners later wrote that the most powerful symbol of the West's resolve was not an aircraft, but self-control. Even when provoked, the airlift refused to become a battlefield. The Soviets wanted conflict. The West responded with professionalism. And every day that this restraint held, the blockade's power diminished. April 16, 1949. A date that should be carved in stone. On that single day, just one rotation of the Earth, Allied crews delivered a staggering 12,941 tons of supplies. More than the city required in 2 full days, more than every expert once claimed possible. Aircraft landed every 63 seconds. Hatches slammed open, cargo poured out, engines revved again, wheels lifted off for the next round. Berliners stood in crowds at Tempelhof, watching aircraft descend with a river of silver wings. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stood with hands over their hearts. The Soviets watched too, and in that moment they knew. The blockade was over. They just hadn't announced it yet. Behind closed doors in Moscow's stone chambers, panic replaced confidence. Reports flowed in. The airlift is unstoppable. Berlin is recovering. Western resolve is strengthening. Propaganda is failing. The blockade, meant to fracture the West, had instead solidified the Western alliance. Germany, once their enemy, was learning gratitude toward the democracies that fed them. The Soviet political gamble had backfired so completely that it bordered on disaster. Stalin realized that continuing the blockade risked turning Berlin into a shrine of Western moral superiority. On May 12, 1949, at 1 minute past midnight, the Soviets lifted all restrictions. Roads reopened, railways resumed, bridges cleared, the Iron Ring loosened. Berliners poured into the streets, lighting candles, singing songs, waving flags of nations they had never visited but felt forever connected to. But the airlift did not stop. Not yet. Tunner ordered operations to continue for 4 more months to prove that Berlin would never again be vulnerable to coercion. It was not just logistics, it was a final message. We feed Berlin because Berlin is free. Throughout the summer of 1949, aircraft continued to thunder along the corridors. Crews who had flown through blizzards now flew through warm skies, carrying surplus supplies to rebuild stockpiles. Berliners lined the runways, waving to pilots whose faces they would never see clearly but would never forget. Children held signs reading, "Thank you for our lives. Thank you for not leaving us. Thank you for freedom." For many pilots, leaving Berlin felt like abandoning family. Some requested extensions. Others returned years later as civilians, walking the streets they had once saved from starvation. Tempelhof Airport became sacred ground, not because of its architecture, not because of its history, but because of what it represented. The sky can be a shield. September 30th, 1949. The operations tower at Tempelhof crackled with static as the final call came through. Spirit of Freedom, cleared for takeoff. Pilots climbed aboard the last C-54 to depart. Ground crews gathered along the taxiway. Berliners filled every inch of the fence line, thousands of them, silent as snowfall. The engines roared to life one last time. Wings lifted, shadows swept across the crowd, and the aircraft climbed into the sky that had saved a city. Tears fell freely. Some waved handkerchiefs, some reached toward the sky as if touching the memory of every flight before it. Berlin had survived, the blockade had failed, and history had turned. When the numbers were finally tallied, the true magnitude of the airlift stunned the world. 277,000 flights, 2.3 million tons of supplies, 92 million miles flown, 78 airmen dead. But statistics cannot describe the real cost. It was written in the hands of ground crews cracked from cold, in the backs of German women carrying sacks of coal, in the eyes of children who learned hope from the sky, in the exhaustion of pilots who flew until their bodies begged for rest, in the courage of commanders who defied the greatest empire on earth without firing a shot. The miracle of the airlift was not measured in tons or miles. It was measured in humanity. The Berlin Airlift became the foundational myth of the Cold War, not a story of destruction, but of salvation. It proved that compassion could be stronger than coercion, that unity could outmatch tyranny, that logistics could defeat intimidation, that the free world would risk everything for even a corner of endangered liberty. Stalin learned a lesson he never forgot. You can blockade a road, you can blockade a railway, you can blockade a canal, but you cannot blockade the sky. And when the sky belongs to free men, no empire can win.